Introduction. The United States has long been a breeding ground for some of the most terrifying minds in history. Every state has at least one monster, but there are places where the numbers rise beyond the norm, where the darkness seems to linger. These places have birthed multiple killers, men and women whose hands have strangled, slashed, poisoned, and shot innocent souls, their motives as chilling as their methods. In this video, we will step into the grim history of 8 states that have housed the most serial killers, from the twisted alleys of New York to the sunlit nightmares of California, from the vast hunting grounds of Texas to the haunting depths of Louisiana's bayous. And this is a journey into the abyss, a walk alongside the worst predators mankind has ever known. This is the story of the killing states. New York, the Empire of Blood. New York, a city of dreams, ambition, and towering skyscrapers, has also been a city of nightmares. The crowded streets, faceless masses, and deep anonymity have provided cover for some of the most feared killers in history. David Berkowitz, known as the Son of Sam, terrorized the city between 1976 and 1977. He struck from the shadows, shooting young couples as they sat in their parked cars, turning summer nights into a battlefield of paranoia. The letters he sent to police, filled with cryptic messages and twisted justifications, painted him as a man ruled by an unseen force. He claimed a demon-possessed dog commanded him to kill. By the time he was caught, he had murdered 6 people and wounded 11 others, his name forever etched in the history of terror. Then there was Richard Angelo, a man who hid behind a mask of mercy. As a nurse, he was entrusted with saving lives, but his hands carried death instead. Under the guise of medical care, he poisoned his patients, sending at least 10 souls to an agonizing demise. Joseph G. Christopher, the Midtown slasher, was a man consumed by racial hatred, his knife carving out his twisted ideology in the flesh of his victims. He prowled New York in the early 1980s, his victims chosen by the color of their skin. He killed at least 12 before his rampage came to an end, leaving a city divided by fear and horror. New York, a beacon of opportunity, has also been a city where evil flourished in the shadows. But as the blood dried on its streets, another state waited, where the nightmares only grew darker. California, the state of nightmares. California, the land of golden beaches, sprawling highways, and the glittering lights of Hollywood, hides a much darker legacy beneath its sunlit exterior. The very state that promises dreams has been home to some of the most vicious nightmares in American history. Its vast cities, transient population, and endless highways have created the perfect hunting grounds for killers who thrived in the shadows. Few names in crime history hold as much mystery as the Zodiac Killer. His reign of terror in the late 1960s and early 1970s remains one of the most infamous unsolved cases. He sent cryptic letters and ciphers to newspapers, taunting the police, playing games with the public, and claiming to have killed 37 people, though only 7 confirmed victims were ever linked to him. His face was never seen, his name never uncovered, and his legend remains an unsolved puzzle in the annals of serial murder. Then came Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, a figure who turned California's warm nights into waking nightmares. Between 1984 and 1985, he crept into homes, slaughtering men, women, and children with no pattern, no motive beyond destruction itself. His victims were helpless, his crimes random, his methods brutal. He left behind satanic symbols, whispered prayers to demons, and spread terror like wildfire. It wasn't the police who caught him. It was an enraged mob in East Los Angeles, everyday citizens who had had enough of the horror and took justice into their own hands. And then there were Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono, the hillside stranglers, who turned the hills of Los Angeles into their own personal graveyard. Disguising themselves as police officers, they lured young women into their car, only to strangle them, torture them, and leave their bodies discarded like broken dolls along the roadsides. California has seen more serial killers than any other state, and its count of victims is the highest in the nation. A state of endless possibilities, yet for so many, it became a final destination. The waves may wash away the footprints in the sand, but they can never erase the blood that has soaked into the soil. As the sun sets on California, another state rises, where the land stretches wide and the killing fields are vast. Texas, the hunting grounds. Texas, a land of endless highways, sprawling deserts, and small towns separated by miles of open road, has long been a predator's paradise. It is a state known for its fierce justice, a place where law and order are deeply ingrained in its identity. But before justice can be served, evil has often had its way. Few serial killers in history have been as insidiously cruel as Janine Jones, the Angel of Death. A nurse, someone parents trusted with the lives of their most vulnerable, she betrayed that trust in the most horrific way imaginable. Between the late 1970s and early 1980s, she injected babies and toddlers with lethal doses of muscle relaxants and other drugs, causing their tiny bodies to shut down in agony. Some died instantly, others suffered in ways that words cannot fully describe. She was convicted of only one murder and one attempted murder, but the true number of her victims is unknown. Some say she killed 11. Others believe the count may be as high as 46. Many of her victims never had names in the public eye, their short lives reduced to missing hospital records, unmarked graves, and unanswered questions. She was supposed to heal, but instead, she thrived in silence, her crimes hidden behind the sterile walls of hospitals. But Jones was not the only monster to call Texas home. Angel Maturino Resendiz, the railroad killer, turned Texas's vast railway network into his personal hunting ground. A drifter, a phantom, he moved across the state undetected, slipping in and out of towns by freight train, choosing victims at random. He struck in the dead of night, breaking into homes near the train tracks, bludgeoning his victims with rocks, hammers, and anything else he could find. He had no pattern, no single type of victim. Young, old, men, women, all fell to his brutality. The randomness of his crimes made him even more terrifying. He had no reason, no remorse. He killed simply because he could. At least 15 people lost their lives before he was finally caught, his reign of terror ending in handcuffs. But perhaps no name in Texas serial killer history carries a weight as heavy as Dean Corll, a man whose nickname belied the horrors he committed. The Candyman, a name that sounds innocent, almost childlike, until the truth is revealed. Corll was no drifter, no phantom moving unseen through the landscape. He lived in Houston, a man with a respectable job and an ordinary life. But behind closed doors, he was something far worse. With 2 teenage accomplices, he lured at least 28 boys into his home, promising them candy, parties, and fun. What awaited them was something out of the depths of hell. They were tortured, raped, and murdered, their bodies discarded in shallow graves across the Texas landscape. Some were found buried in a boat shed, others in remote fields, their remains whispering of the agony they endured. But Corll's reign of terror did not end with an arrest. It ended with a bullet. One of his own teenage accomplices, Elmer Wayne Henley, turned a gun on him in a fit of rage, shooting him dead before he could claim another life. It was a moment of sudden, violent retribution, a killer meeting the fate he had inflicted upon so many others. Texas is a land that prides itself on its toughness, a state where justice is swift and severe. But even here, in this place of grit and law, the predators have thrived. They have moved through the vast highways, the desolate landscapes, the crowded cities, their victims scattered like forgotten footprints in the dust. The ghosts of Texas remain. They linger in the wind, whispering for those who never got away, those whose names were lost beneath the weight of history. The state's killers may be locked away or buried, but their stories remain, etched into the land itself. Beyond Texas, deeper into the heart of the country, another state awaits. A place where crime and corruption have given rise to some of the most infamous killers of all time. Illinois, the killer clown's playground. Illinois, a state where the towering skyline of Chicago meets the quiet, unassuming suburbs, has long been a breeding ground for crime. From the days of Prohibition and Al Capone to the cold-blooded nightmares that lurked behind ordinary faces, Illinois has harbored some of the most terrifying killers in history. No name is more synonymous with horror in Illinois than John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. By day, he was a respected businessman, the friendly face at neighborhood gatherings, the man who dressed as Pogo the Clown to entertain children at charity events. But beneath the grease paint and forced smiles, he was a predator. He lured teenage boys into his home, offering them work, a place to stay, or the false promise of kindness. What awaited them instead was death. He strangled and tortured his victims, disposing of them in the crawlspace beneath his house. By the time the full scope of his horror was uncovered, at least 33 young men and boys had fallen victim to him. Their bodies were stacked beneath his home like discarded trash, their names erased from existence until investigators unearthed the truth. Even in his final moments before execution, Gacy remained defiant, his last words a chilling testament to his utter lack of remorse. "Kiss my ass." But Gacy was not the only monster Illinois had to offer. There was Robin Gecht, the mastermind behind a twisted cult known as the Chicago Rippers, a group of men who turned murder into ritualistic depravity. Alongside his accomplices, Edward Spreitzer and the Corcorales brothers, Gecht kidnapped women off the streets of Chicago, dragging them into a nightmare that defied belief. Their victims were mutilated, tortured, and butchered, their suffering turned into offerings for whatever dark forces Gecht claimed to serve. They were not merely killers, they were sadists, reveling in their blood-soaked crimes. Illinois was also home to William Heron's, the lipstick killer, whose reign of terror in the 1940s left the city gripped with fear. His crimes were marked by a chilling message scrawled in lipstick on the wall of one of his crime scenes. "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." It was both a confession and a warning, an admission that the monster inside him had taken full control. He was just a teenager when he began his killing spree, breaking into homes, attacking women, and leaving behind chaos in his wake. His arrest brought an end to the terror, but the words he had written remained a haunting echo of the uncontrollable darkness that drove him. Chicago and its surrounding areas have long been a place where both ambition and desperation have thrived. The city, alive and electric, has always carried an undercurrent of something sinister. The same streets where industry flourished also harbored murderers, men who walked among the innocent, hiding in plain sight. The killers of Illinois were not faceless shadows in the night. They were the men who lived next door, the ones no one ever suspected. Illinois has written its own history in blood, its past filled with the echoes of the victims who never saw their deaths coming. Some killers were caught, their legacies sealed in criminal infamy. Others, perhaps, still walk free, their crimes buried beneath the weight of time. As Illinois fades into the distance, another state rises on the horizon, where the killings continued and the horrors never ceased. Ohio, the heart of darkness. Ohio, a state of rolling fields, quiet suburbs, and cities that pulse with industry, holds a darkness that lingers beneath the surface. The heartland of America, yet within its borders, some of the most cold-blooded murderers have left their marks, turning ordinary neighborhoods into hunting grounds. Among them was Sean Great, a predator who hid in the abandoned ruins of forgotten buildings, preying on women who were lost, vulnerable, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. He did not lure them with charm or deception. He took them by force, imprisoning them in his world of decay and death. From 2006 to 2016, he raped, strangled, and killed at least 5 women. His reign of terror might have continued for years had it not been for one of his captives, a woman who refused to become just another silent victim. Chained and terrified, she managed to seize a fleeting chance for survival, dialing 911 in a whisper, barely daring to breathe as she pleaded for help. The dispatcher listened as she described her prison, the horror in her voice unmistakable. When police arrived, they found her alive, but around her, the remnants of Great's evil were everywhere. Bodies decomposing, discarded, their voices forever silenced. The house was a tomb, a place where life had been stolen, where fear had lived. Though most of his murders took place in Wisconsin, Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, had his roots in Ohio. His first kill happened here, in the quiet town of Bath, a town that never could have known the nightmare it was about to birth. Dahmer was just 18 years old when he bludgeoned and dismembered Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker who had unknowingly stepped into the lair of a budding monster. This was not just murder. It was the beginning of something far more sinister. The horrors that would come later, cannibalism, necrophilia, and acts of unspeakable violence, all began here in the quiet Ohio countryside. The town may have looked ordinary, but within it, a mind was unraveling, a hunger growing, a darkness taking shape. Ohio has also been home to other killers, ones whose names never gained the notoriety of Great or Dahmer, but whose crimes were just as chilling. The state has provided the backdrop for brutal murders, bodies buried beneath the soil, secrets locked behind doors that may never be opened. Some killers were caught, their names and crimes etched into criminal history. Others remain unknown, their victims remembered only in cold case files, their stories left unfinished. The streets of Ohio do not forget. The fields that stretch endlessly toward the horizon have held more than just crops. They have concealed horrors that will never be fully uncovered. The highways, the rivers, the towns where children once played without fear, beneath them, the echoes of the past still linger, whispering of the monsters who once called this place home. And as Ohio's darkness recedes, another state looms. A place where the silence of its backroads and the isolation of its landscapes have given birth to some of the most chilling figures in history. Indiana, the silent slaughters. Indiana, a state of endless cornfields, quiet highways, and towns, has also been home to some of the most unassuming monsters in history. Here, killers have hidden behind ordinary facades, living among families, friends, and co-workers who never suspected the horrors lurking behind their doors. No killer exemplifies this deception more than Herb Baumeister, a wealthy businessman, a devoted husband, and the owner of a sprawling estate called Fox Hollow Farm. To the outside world, he had built a perfect life, prosperous, respectable, and utterly unremarkable. But beneath the surface of his charming suburban existence lay a darkness few could have imagined. For years, young men had been disappearing from the Indianapolis area, last seen at local gay bars before vanishing without a trace. The truth came to light when investigators finally connected the disappearances to Baumeister. A search of his 18-acre property led to a discovery so horrifying it would haunt law enforcement for years to come. The remains of at least 11 men were scattered across the wooded estate, their bones buried in shallow graves or hidden beneath the trees. He had lured them in with promises of companionship, only to strangle them, reducing them to nameless fragments in the dirt. Baumeister never faced justice. Before he could be arrested, he fled to Canada, where he took his own life with a single gunshot. His death left behind more questions than answers, leaving families without closure, and the full extent of his crimes shrouded in mystery. Some believe he may have been responsible for even more murders, the rest of his victims forever lost to time. But Indiana's darkness stretches further back in time. Belle Gunness, one of the most prolific female serial killers in history, turned her LaPorte farmhouse into a graveyard. She was not the kind of killer who stalked the streets or lurked in the shadows. Instead, she invited death into her home, luring men from across the country with newspaper ads, promising them love, security, and a fresh start. Hopeful and eager to begin their new lives, they arrived at her farm, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. Gunnis killed for profit, poisoning, bludgeoning, or burning her victims alive to claim their life insurance payouts and possessions. By the time her crimes were exposed, at least 40 bodies had been uncovered on her land. But just as the law was closing in, her house mysteriously burned to the ground, her charred remains supposedly found in the wreckage. Some believe she faked her death and disappeared into the world, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a legacy of blood. Then there was Larry Eyler, the highway killer, a predator who used Indiana's endless roads as his personal hunting ground. He picked up hitchhikers and drifters, offering them rides, only to strangle, stab, and mutilate them before dumping their bodies in ditches and fields. He was methodical, his cruelty relentless, and his victims often forgotten, the nameless, the lost, the ones no one would notice missing. His kill count was estimated at more than 20 young men, their bodies left to be swallowed by the landscape, abandoned like roadside debris. Unlike so many other killers who evaded capture for years, Eyler's crimes eventually caught up with him. He was convicted and sentenced to death, but before he could face execution, he died in prison. In his final days, he confessed to many of his murders, but some cases remain unsolved, their victims still waiting for justice. Indiana is a place where killers have walked among the living, unnoticed, unsuspected, their evil masked by the everyday normalcy of small-town life. Even today, cold cases linger, whispers of those who have never been caught. Some killers remain undiscovered, their crimes buried beneath decades of silence. Others have simply disappeared, their victims lost to time, their stories waiting to be unearthed. And as the cornfields stretch on into the distance, the horizon shifts. Beyond the farmland and quiet roads lies another state, a place where the swamps and bayous have hidden horrors of their own. Louisiana, Bayou of Death. Louisiana, a land of mist-covered swamps, voodoo legends, and the echoes of a history drenched in mystery, has long been a place where the dead do not always rest. The serial killers have found their hunting grounds here, moving like ghosts among the living, their presence known only when it is too late. No name looms larger in Louisiana's dark history than Samuel Little, the most prolific serial killer in American history. For decades, he drifted from state to state, a shadow that left nothing but silence in his wake. His victims were the overlooked, the women whose disappearances barely made the news, the ones no one came looking for. Arrested multiple times over the years, he evaded true justice, slipping through the cracks of the system like a specter. It wasn't until much later, when the full scope of his horror was revealed, that the world realized the extent of his crimes. He confessed to 93 murders, his memory so chillingly precise that he could describe each victim's face with haunting detail, recalling their features long after their names had been forgotten. Many of his killings took place in Louisiana, where he lurked in the shadows, finding those who had no one to protect them. He was a predator who needed no hunting ground. His reach extended across the country, a network of forgotten bodies that could never speak for themselves. Another monster who haunted Louisiana was Ronald Dominique, the Bayou Strangler. Unlike most serial killers, he did not strike in the chaos of the city or along the empty highways. He hunted in the deep, quiet reaches of small-town Louisiana, where life moved slow and death went unnoticed. His victims were men, lured by false promises, enticed by his unassuming demeanor. For over a decade, he operated in silence, unseen, unsuspected, and undisturbed. By the time his reign ended, at least 23 men had been raped and murdered, their bodies discarded in drainage ditches, sugarcane fields, and desolate roadsides, left to rot under the unforgiving Louisiana sun. His arrest brought an end to one of the most calculated and long-running killing sprees in the state's history. But when confronted with his crimes, Dominique showed no regret, no horror, just a quiet acceptance of what he had done, as though murder had become second nature. Then there was Derek Todd Lee, the Baton Rouge serial killer, a man who thrived in the heart of Louisiana's capital. He did not hunt in the swamps, nor did he drift along the highways like a ghost. He was bold, striking in the very heart of the city, breaking into homes, invading the intimate spaces where his victims should have been safest. His crimes were not spread across faceless landscapes but carried out in the streets, in the homes of innocent women who had no way of knowing that a killer lurked just outside their door. From 1998 to 2003, he spread terror through Baton Rouge, his victims all women, brutally beaten and stabbed to death in their own bedrooms. The fear in the city was suffocating, as police scrambled to track the killer who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. Women lived in fear, double-locking their doors, looking over their shoulders in parking lots, wondering if they were next. It wasn't until DNA evidence finally linked Lee to his crimes that the hunt came to an end. His capture brought relief, but the damage had already been done. The city he had terrorized would never be the same again. Louisiana has always been a place where history and legend intertwine, where the living walk alongside ghosts. The bayous and backroads have hidden the bodies of the forgotten, the ones who never got to tell their stories. The swamps whisper their secrets, but not all ghosts remain in the dark. Some fight to be remembered. Some refuse to be buried beneath time. The victims of these killers, their lives stolen in moments of horror, deserve more than silence. Their names, their faces, their stories, they are part of the very land itself, etched into the history of Louisiana, woven into the fabric of its haunted past. And as the swamp waters ripple and the night grows still, the darkness does not end. It only moves. Beyond the edges of Louisiana, past the cities and through the forgotten towns, another place calls. A state where serial killers have walked in silence, hiding in the shadows of everyday life, waiting for the moment to strike. Pennsylvania, the House of Horrors. Pennsylvania, a state steeped in colonial history and industrial might, holds a legacy far darker than its historic landmarks and rolling countryside suggest. Beneath its steel mills and quiet neighborhoods, monsters have lurked in basements and alleys, preying on those who never saw them coming. It is a place where some of the most chilling crimes in American history have unfolded, leaving behind tales that haunt the history. None is more infamous than Gary Heidnik, the twisted mind behind Philadelphia's House of Horrors. Heidnik was no ordinary killer. He was a man who built his own dungeon, a chamber of suffering hidden beneath his home, where he kept women chained like animals. He kidnapped them off the streets, imprisoning them in his basement, torturing them in ways too horrific to imagine. He starved them, beat them, and in an act of unimaginable cruelty, forced them to eat the remains of those who did not survive. His victims lived in filth and darkness, bound and broken, listening to the muffled cries of others who shared their fate. One by one, they disappeared, their bodies discarded in ways too grotesque to describe. But Heidnik made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the resilience of those he had captured. One woman, after enduring unspeakable torment, found her chance to escape. She ran through the streets, half naked and trembling, desperate for help. When police followed her back to Heidnik's home, they uncovered a horror that defied explanation. What they found beneath his house, a torture chamber, human remains, evidence of suffering beyond comprehension, would remain one of the darkest discoveries in Philadelphia's history. Heidnik was sentenced to death and executed in 1999, but the horrors of his basement would never be forgotten. Then there was Harvey Miguel Robinson, a name that sent shockwaves through Pennsylvania's criminal history, not just for his brutality, but for his youth. He was just 17 years old when he began his killing spree, making him one of the youngest serial killers in American history. He had no pattern, no clear motive beyond a primal thirst for violence. His victims were women, attacked in the supposed safety of their own homes. He stalked them, breaking in under the cover of darkness, raping and strangling them in their beds. Allentown, a city that had never known such terror, was plunged into fear. His attacks were ruthless, calculated, and without hesitation. He was young, but there was nothing adolescent about the brutality of his crimes. His mistake, however, came when one of his intended victims survived. She escaped his grip, her body bruised and battered but alive, and she led police straight to him. His cold, expressionless face showed no remorse when he was arrested. There was no confession, no attempt to explain his actions, just an unsettling vacancy, as if the humanity in him had been long erased. Pennsylvania has also been home to other depraved minds, men who have preyed on the innocent and left behind only terror in their wake. Harrison Graham, another killer from Philadelphia, turned his own home into a tomb. He lived among his victims, their bodies hidden in his apartment, the stench of decay seeping through the walls before his crimes were discovered. Neighbors had long suspected something was wrong, the putrid smell, the eerie silence, but no one could have imagined the horror that lay beyond his doors. And then there was Mark Spots, a man whose thirst for blood turned Pennsylvania into his own personal hunting ground. He was not the calculated, methodical killer that so many others were. He was a spree killer, a man who killed simply because he could. His rampage stretched across the state, his victims chosen at random, murdered without warning. He left no time for police to react, no pattern for them to follow. Death followed in his wake, unpredictable and relentless, until he was finally caught and brought to justice. Pennsylvania, with its rich history and picturesque landscapes, has also been home to some of the darkest souls in America's past. The killers who walked these streets left scars that will never fully heal. Their crimes are written into the history of the state, whispered about in the corners of the cities they once terrorized. But their stories do not just belong to the past. Even today, cold cases linger, missing persons remain unaccounted for, and somewhere, in the depths of the unknown, there may be another monster waiting. Evil does not die. It lingers, watching, waiting, hidden in the places no one thinks to look. And Pennsylvania, like the other killing states before it, has already proven it knows how to hide a monster. This state, with its rich history and picturesque landscapes, has also been home to some of the darkest souls in America's past. The echoes of their crimes linger in the alleys, the fields, and the quiet neighborhoods where horror once hid in plain sight. The shadows stretch long over Pennsylvania, and with them, the journey through the killing states comes to an end. But the stories do not. The names of the forgotten victims still whisper through time, their voices lost in the corridors of history. America has always been a land of opportunity, of promise, of dreams. But in places like these, beneath the illusion of safety, nightmares took shape. The predators did not lurk in darkness. They walked among the unsuspecting, blending into everyday life, waiting for the moment to strike. Some were caught, others vanished into legend, their secrets buried alongside their victims. Yet one truth remains. Evil does not belong to a single place. It lingers, shifting, adapting, waiting. The killing states may be written into history, but killers do not disappear. They evolve, they find new hunting grounds. The question is no longer where they were, it is where they will be next. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe for more chilling videos.